Hello. In this video, we're going to write some tests for Laravel. Start by running the Docker desktop app. And with that running, we can navigate to our project folder. And we can run the container, the Docker container, with ddev start. This will take some time, especially if it's the first time running. It has to download any sort of images that it needs. If you have PHP and Composer installed, then we can run this next step without SSHing into the container, which I would recommend because it's a little bit faster if you can do it locally, and that is Composer update. This will download, of course, all the PHP packages that we need. In my case, I believe I already have them downloaded. If you list the files, you'll notice that we don't have an env file. So we're going to generate one by copying the example. So copy and then we should be good. If we run ddev describe, we can see how to access the various services that are being hosted here. So control click on here will open up our Laravel in the browser. And you'll notice that Laravel is running, but we don't have an app key. So let's generate one. This we can generate with an artisan command. Again, if you don't have PHP, you're going to want to SSH into the container here. And even if you do, you might want to SSH in anyway. We're going to run PHP artisan key generate. And now our application should run. So Laravel now works. It does connect to a database, but there are no tables set up in that database yet. So we're going to run our migration scripts here to build those tables. So that's also another artisan command. So PHP artisan migrate will migrate those tables. For this demo, we do have a movies table, and we're going to be creating movies and deleting movies from that table. And also we have a users table, and users have a relationship to their favorite movie. And so we'll see and test those relationships and values. I believe our setup is finished, and now we can start writing code. So I'm going to exit the SSH shell and open up VS Code. From here on out, I'll use the terminal that's built into VS Code, so I'll close this one. Okay, let's check out our routes. I've created some API-like routes here for getting all the movies in the database, storing a new movie in the database, and deleting movies in the database. For today's example, I've put them in the web routes folder, but if this were an actual API, they would go in the API folder so that it gets the proper middleware assigned to those routes. So each of these routes is pointing to a function inside of the movie controller class, so we can take a look at those with a control click and see what each of them do. This first one returns all the movies in the database. It calls the all function inside of our movie model to do that, and then just returns the results. The store function, also pretty simple. It validates some values that are being passed to it. So to call this route, we have to pass a name, a description, and a year. And then if those values meet validation here, if they pass validation, we can then create a new movie model in the database. And then we return that movie model back. And of course, the delete endpoint, we pass an ID. It looks up that movie in the database, and if that movie exists, it then deletes it and returns an empty response. So we can test at least some of this in the browser. We're going to test that first route that returns all the movies. It should be at our site/movies. And you can see we have a JSON encoded result here. So we have a movies array that is currently empty. Not only do these routes exist, but we also have a relationship between a few of our models. So if we do happen to find the models folder up here in the app folder, we can see that we have a movie model, which has values name, description, and year, and a user model, which has some values in it as well. But the important thing that we want to notice is this relationship in each of them. So each user has a favorite movie, although here I just called it movie, and it has a relationship off to the movie class, and vice versa. We've got in the movie class, we have a users relationship, and this would return any users that have this particular movie as their favorite. So the relationship is a little different. It's a one-to-many relationship. And we're going to test that relationship as well as these routes. So to get started, we can run a command, an artisan command. So let's start with our endpoint tests first. We're going to run php artisan make : and then test, and then the name of our test. So we're going to be testing the movie controller, specifically the movie endpoints. So we could call this movie endpoint or movies endpoints test and hit enter. This in the test folder creates a new file in the feature folder. So we have two test suites, a feature test suite and a unit test suite. Laravel does have an example test in both folders. You can look at that if you want, but ultimately you'll probably want to delete those files. Okay, our movies endpoint test. We currently have one test. What we're going to want to do, of course, is replace this with an actual test. We want to test that each of our endpoints works. So first one is we'll test the fetch all movies endpoint. So test fetch all movies. Okay, we can kind of see the structure here. There's a get function that sends off a request, in this case a get request to a particular endpoint. We want to do that. We want to send a request off to the movies endpoint. And then we can assert some values in the results. So asserting that we get a 200 response back is what we want. And you can double check that as well. Yeah, 200 status code. So we can run this with php artisan test. We'll run all of our tests. And we have a failed test. What does it say? I should zoom out here a little bit. Oh yes, okay, so the problem here is that I'm not SSH'd into the container. It can't access the database from where I'm trying to run PHP. So let me try that again. ddev SSH. Okay, now let's try php artisan test. It runs a bit slower, but it does pass the test. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. We could improve the readability a little bit here if we want to by method chaining. You know, that's a pretty cool feature. We could also chain on another assert, or as many asserts as we want. So if we take a look, there should be at the very least the word movies in that response. So I'm just going to assert that we can see the word movies. And that worked. All right, that's good enough for now. Let's write another test. We don't need another file for this test. We can put more tests in the same file. So let's create the test for our create movies endpoint. So public function. All of our tests, in this case, in PHP unit, have to start with the word test, and all of our test classes have to end with the word test. So make sure that those are there. So test, this is store new movie, or create movie, something like that. This, I believe that's a post request to the movies endpoint. If it's successful, we should have a status code of 202, I believe. So if we come back here to movie controller, yeah, 202 status code. We can try to run this, but if you're paying attention, you'll notice that it shouldn't pass the test because our current request doesn't send this information, name, description, or year, so it won't pass the validation because name is required and year is required. But let's see what that looks like. Okay, it fails the test, and it tells you why. It expected a 202 status code, but it received a 302 status code. And here it's nice enough to actually tell us a little bit about why, that the name field is required. This is part of, I believe, the response. But if you actually want to see the full response, you can run the dump command. And since we're basically, the assert is chaining off of the response and returning the response, we can just chain a dump onto here. Although, since the assert is coming before the dump, I don't think we'll see the dump. Yeah, we're not seeing anything. So let me flip these around here. We'll put the dump first, and then do the assert. All right, now if I scroll up, there's the dump right here. So this is the actual response that comes back. Interesting. It's a little different than what I expected, but so the 302 response, yeah, we're not passing validation, and because we're on a web route, I guess it's doing a redirect instead of returning, I think like a 409 or whatever it should be returning here, 422 maybe. But in any case, we can adjust this here. We can pass a value in, or rather several values. So when we send a request to this endpoint, we need to send in a name for the movie. A description would be nice. And I think year was the last value. So I'm going to go with the matrix. You know, some sort of value there. 1999. There we go, 99. And run this and see if it passes. Oh, cool, that passes. We can also, of course, assert some values that are in the response. So like here we have assert see movies. We could assert that we see, you know, this specific movie. In fact, we could do assert JSON path, and this is an interesting one that lets us specify a path. So let's see, I believe it would be movie, and then it would have hopefully the values name, description, and year. So if we did movie dot name, for example, this would hopefully give us a value of the matrix. Okay. Let's write a test for our third endpoint here. So public function test. This is testing the delete movie endpoint. And so for this one, you know, obviously we have to have a movie in the database first before we can delete it. Well, so in fact, let's go to the controller here and see what it says. Yeah, if we pass an ID value that doesn't exist, we should expect to see a 404 response. So it would make sense for us to test that as well. So we could say this, we're going to send a delete request to movies / and I'll use a number, like maybe a negative number, and see what that does. and then we want to assert a status of 404. Okay, that worked. So, yeah, what we want to do here is we probably want to mock a movie. So maybe put a movie in the database and then delete the movie. And then we want to somehow assert that it's no longer in the database or that it's been deleted. At the very least, we can assert that the response comes back as a 204. But if we wanted to take it a step further, we could assert that it no longer exists even in the database. So to mock a movie, we could, of course, call our endpoint that creates a movie, but then we create some sort of weird dependency here where in order for this test to pass, this other unrelated endpoint has to be working. And we kind of want to avoid any sort of possible interdependencies there. We can mock the movie, of course, by just calling movie, and then create would be one way to create a movie. And we could pass in all the values. But let's take this opportunity to create a movie factory. So we're going to run another artisan command. This would be php artisan make factory. And in this case, this would be our movie factory. Cool. We're going to open that up. Movie factory. I should put it in the correct folder too, in the correct database factories folder. And what this allows us to do is to put in some default values whenever we want to fake a movie or build a movie. So what do we want the name to be by default? We could, of course, have a value here. We could randomize it, and we'll be randomizing it using a library called Faker, which is built in. So if we just say this, Faker words, we can say, give me 3 words and glue them together into a single string. And that's simple enough that I think it works for lots of applications. So we can do the same thing here. Say, give me 10 words, and we'll make that be the description. I wrote descriptions, but description. And then the year. We want a fake number, so we'll do this, faker, and let's try number between. And I think if we go to the endpoint, yeah, the validation expects the number to be between 1900 and 2022. So it'll fail if it's outside of that range. So our factory will say, give me a number between those 1900 and 2022. So that's all we need in our movie factory. We can close that file. And now back in our test, when we go to mock the movie, instead of calling movie create, we're going to call movie factory create. And now we get a new movie object. We have an unrecognized type here, so I'll just put the cursor in and press tab, which should put the use statement up here for us. But to delete this movie in the database, we are going to use that endpoint we created. So we're going to say this. Actually, it's the same endpoint, so maybe we'll just copy this line and paste it. But the ID number, we're going to insert. So I'll make this an interpreted string, and we'll say movie ID. So we'll get the ID value that's inside the movie object. And hopefully this returns a 204. Let's run this. Now when we run PHP artisan test, it's running all of the tests, which is okay, but sometimes you want to say, I just want to run this one specific test. So we can do that with with PHP artisan test -- filter, and then either the file name or the test name that you want. So we want any tests that have delete movie in their name. And that one test does pass. Well, let's take it a step further and see if that movie is in the database or not. I think there are a couple ways of doing this, but I'll just look it up with the find function. We'll say movie find, and we'll pass in that ID that should still be in the movie object. We can store this in the same variable if we want. And then I just want to assert that this is null. So we would say this assert assert null, and we'll pass in the movie. So, yep, that test passes as well. So this is just a really simple example of how we can test these 3 endpoints to verify that they're working. And of course, with each of them, we could test more values. We could do more asserts if we want to be more certain about the values that are coming back. Okay, let's write a couple unit tests, and then we'll be done. I want to write a unit test that when we call any movie's user's value, that it does in fact return one or more user objects. And same thing, if we call on a user object, if we call its movie value here, that it does in fact return a movie if it has one set up in the database. So we're going to write another test. So with the PHP artisan command, PHP artisan make test, I usually do this, I would usually do a test file for the user model and another file for the movie model, but maybe we'll just kind of combine them into a single file. So we'll say favorite movie test, and we're going to put -- unit after it so that this goes into the unit test suite. Okay. So this is one of our test files here. It has an example unit test in it. We're going to rename this to be, we're going to test that our users have a favorite movie. So we can say test user has favorite movie. Again, I feel a little weird because here I'm calling it favorite movie, but in the actual user, we're just calling it movie, but that's kind of what it's meant to represent. So we need a user, first of all. So we need to mock a user. Or we can pluck a user from the database, but usually we don't want to rely on there already being one. So let's see if there's a user factory. We say user factory create. And then we want to call that user's movie property here. Now, by default, that value is probably null. So we'll see what gets returned. But we're going to do an assert with this assert instance of. Okay, so the first thing is, the first parameter we pass in is the class that we're checking to see of the second parameter, if that makes sense. So the second parameter is the user movie, and then we're going to test to see that it is the movie class. Oh, if I can type it. So we're going to run our test, PHP artisan test -- filter, and we can just do user has, and that test currently fails. Okay, so I forgot a step here. When we create the unit test, it uses the wrong test case here as a base class. We have in our test suite, we have our own base class called test case. We should be extending this class, and the unit stub does not do that for whatever reason. So let's try to fix this by saying use tests / test case, and then see if our test works at that point. All right, cool, that did work. We need to do probably some sort of cleanup now after the test. So after mocking a movie and a user and then doing the assert, we need to delete those objects. So in this case, we probably want to delete the user first. We say user, delete, we'll remove it from the database, and movie delete should do the same. We're going to write the inverse test. So public function test movies are favorited by users. It's probably a dumb name, but maybe I'll fix it later. If we just want to mock the movie, we can do that, because what gets returned when we call the movies users, so when you say movie users like this, is it returns a collection object. So it's not going to return a single user, but rather a collection of users. And it's okay if that collection contains 0 users. So the instance here would be a collection like so. Now I'm guessing this test doesn't know what a collection is. Yep, so we're going to have to bring in this statement. There are several that we could choose from, so it's important that we choose one of the correct ones. So I'm going to go with the Illuminate database one. All right, let's run these tests. Why don't we just use the word favorite as our filter? And it looks like both tests now pass. Now, if we wanted to, we could take this, we could take it further. We could do the thing where we put the user in there, like before, and then we could possibly do an assert of how many users come back, or that this collection contains this specific user. We could do all those things as well. So I guess just for example, let's try asserting that this movie has a count of so many. So this would be just, I guess, this assert, and we would count or assert that count has a value of 1. Okay, assert equals. So I think that concludes the demo. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for watching.